So, are there differences between men and women? Well, yes, of course there are. But that answer can only be understood if we understand what we're talking about when we say men and women. So, now let's first talk about gender, or at least define gender. I would define this as the socially constructed roles and characteristics by which culture defines male and female. In other words, sex, male and female, is biologically defined. Gender is culturally defined. Things like the pictures below. Girls tend to play with dolls. That might be more of a female characteristic. Boys play with trucks. That might be more of a male characteristic. But these are totally culturally influenced. They are totally learned through our society. And so again, we see social learning theory, which is a large, I would say, influence of behaviorism, the idea that our environment determines who we are. So again, of course, there are differences between men and women. In fact, let's consider some of the more obvious ones. So the first is aggression. Now, time and time again, researchers have shown that males tend to be more physically aggressive than females. But why is that? So you could take a biological approach. You could say men have higher levels of testosterone than women. It's the testosterone. But if I grow up in a culture where it's, more typical for males to be more aggressive than females, I'm going to learn that behavior as a male. In other words, it's almost impossible to separate sex from gender. The idea that males might act more aggressive because that's more of a typical male thing. Think about the idea like boys don't cry. So, boys don't cry is a cultural, it's an artifact. It's telling boys that to be in this category, to be appropriate as this gender, don't show weakness. So again, the fact that males tend to be more physically aggressive, it's almost impossible to say if that's just biologically determined. Of course, you could look at other animals, but even so, we don't necessarily know that research extrapolates to humans. It probably does, of course, though. So biology, of course, plays a role. Another example is social connectedness. Research suggests that women tend to have stronger social networks than men do. Now, part of that is emotionality. Men tend to be less emotional than women. But again, is this biologically influenced or is it social learning theory? In other words, if let's say we give a girl a doll for her birthday, isn't that kind of training her to be more interpersonal? In other words, she goes to her room. She has these make-believe settings where she's interacting with another doll, with a person. You know what I mean? So she's getting practice by maybe she comes up with a story. Like, I'm making this up, but oh no, we're out of bread for our sandwich, and what are we going to do? And she has the doll pretend to respond. So she's engaging in this socio-dramatic interaction where she learns to be more in touch with emotions and how to interact with others because of the doll, as opposed to it strictly being a difference of hormones. So are we, are males and females different in terms of social connectedness? Do women tend to have stronger social networks because of the fact that they are biologically female? Or is it something that is the product of learned associations through cultural norms? Well, it's probably both, but again, we are largely influenced by our culture more than any other animal. I've said it before, we are less bound by instinct than any other animal. So here's something that we're going to end on, this idea of gender differences. Back in, I believe it was 1992, a very famous book was published by a guy named John Gray. And that book is pictured right there for you. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. This was a pop psychology book where the thesis was basically that men and women are so different, it's almost like they're from different planets. And this was a really popular book. It, permeated our society, and many people heard about it. If they didn't read about it, they talked about it, they saw it on the news. So it spreads this idea that men and women are extremely different from one another. But empirical data might suggest a different story. So in 2005, a researcher named Janet Hyde from the University of Wisconsin at Madison conducted a meta-analysis of gender studies. So a meta-analysis, you might be familiar with that term. It means to take a bunch of research on a similar topic and sort of bring it together to summarize. So what Janet Hyde did was she identified dozens and dozens and dozens of studies looking at differences between males and females on a variety of characteristics. And what she did was put them all together to see whether or not it's true. Are men and women all that different? Now, I want you to read this on your own. I want you to actually read the full article. It's going to be posted on Canvas, so definitely read the full article. It's called The Gender Similarities Hypothesis. But here's the punchline. Here's the result. And remember, she is summarizing scientific data, whereas John Gray wasn't exactly doing that. So the scientific data suggest that on all of the different characteristics that have been studied, the overwhelming majority of them show very little differences. In other words, the differences between men and women are small or non-existent on most categories. Now, of course, there are exceptions. Like I said, aggression, for example. Physical power. Men are more physically powerful on average than women. For example, on average, men can lift more weights. That is biologically influenced. Men have different body structures, body sizes than women on average. But what's important to note is that on the majority of characteristics that have been studied, and there are many of them, the differences between men and women are simply not as great as we might expect. But I don't think that's the message that we often hear. Again, the media portrays men and women as very different from one another, but the scientific data might, challenge that assumption. So take a look at the article, The Gender Similarities Hypothesis, and, decide what you think for yourself. Are men and women all that different? And if they are different, if men and women are different, is it influenced by our sex differences, as male and female based off of the sex chromosomes? And all those genetic influences? Or is it social learning theory? Is it the idea that our society provides a lens or a schema that we use to organize what it means to be male or female based off of cultural artifacts? All right, so there you have it. Human sexuality, it is biopsychosocially influenced. Both nature and nurture influence our thoughts and behaviors when it comes to sex.